Welcome everyone. My name is Rick Seaman for Veterans Network, and the show is C4. This will be panel discussions on important issues involving veterans. We are back, and our first discussion on C4 will be on Agent Orange. I'd like to introduce my guests. To my right, to your camera left, I have Mr. Dave Culmer. Dave was 20 years in the U.S. Marine Corps, 22 years with the Veterans Administration as a benefit counselor and vet center therapist. And Dave is currently service director for the American Legion's Los Angeles County Council. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
To my immediate right, to your left, is Shad Meshad, president and founder of the National Veterans Foundation. Shad was also the founder of the VA Vet Center program, now in its 28th year. Shad served in Vietnam in 1970 as a U.S. Army captain, mental health officer. Shad, good to have you on.
Thank you.
To my left and to your right is Judith Coburn. Judith was a journalist in Vietnam, 1970 to 1973. She's covered war in the Middle East and Central America, and she's written numerous articles on civilian casualties and veterans' difficulties. To my far left is Tad Foster. Tad is a disabled Vietnam combat Marine vet. Tad is a cartoonist and was the author of the Vietnam funny book, An Antidote to Insanity. Folks, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
As your host, I've been asked to make an opening statement, which I shall do. My statement does not necessarily reflect the opinions of my guests. Agent Orange is often referred to as the last battle. Was it a result of ignorance, short-sightedness, or greed? Yes, it was. Were there cover-ups? Yes, there were cover-ups. And could those cover-ups be interpreted as abandonment or betrayal? Betrayal of the soldiers who fought for this government? Yes. Have we pointed enough fingers? One may never know. Are there thousands of soldiers who will still fall? Yes. Can this next generation of government and military leaders prevent another American tragedy? Another great American fuck-up? Can we learn from our mistakes? Ladies, gentlemen, welcome to C4.
Well, I am happy to be here. I think one of the many things that separated Vietnam vets from all other veterans in the American War was just trying to come home to a very negative society and you know, the old saying, you know, confusing the war with the warrior and that sort of thing. But in '75, of course, this Agent Orange issue came to light to me, and I was really blown away. I remember after spending days with Jack McCloskey, I started reflecting back on my own activities in Vietnam, and many of them were flying from Da Nang to Quang Tri up in I Corps where I was stationed, and where most of the Marines during the war were stationed in that sector of the military demilitarized zone. And I used to fly up once a week up to Quang Tri, and we used to trail these, at that time, C-130s. I know they flew C-123s all over the country spraying it, but you know, it looked like they were just spraying fertilizer or whatever. We used to trail them going up every morning, every week, and I never knew what it was. They said it was something about, you know, clearing the jungle or whatever. Never paid any mind to it.
Right.
But it wasn't until the mid '70s up till the early '80s, Agent Orange just exploded on the national front, and I started recalling because in '75, once again, I had by that time buried 3 of my patients with multiple cancers. and there was no family history, and I remembered that. They were in my caseload in Los Angeles. And once again, it didn't have that name, but there was no explanation to have 3 or 4 types of terminal cancer in one individual at 23, and one was 25 years old.
Yeah.
So that was my introduction
Right.
to
Now,
Agent Orange.
like Shad and Dave and Tad here, you guys were in Vietnam. Dave, you were there in 65.
5 and 66, yeah.
Tad, you were there 68
68,
and
69.
69. Did you ever really hear the word Agent Orange when you were in country? I don't remember hearing it. I was there in 69.
No, I don't remember hearing it.
So that tells us a little bit about on the historical end of it. Most soldiers that were there during those years probably didn't even know it was happening, unless you were directly involved in the flights or the transportation of the chemicals. Just a ground soldier or a soldier out in the field.
I don't think they knew what was happening unless they were in a direct path of the spraying.
And actually visually see it, and you
Visually
go, "Oh, what's
seeing
that coming out of that plane?"
Right. And or when the bush is wet, when it's not from dew early in the morning.
True.
But also, even the guys involved in the spraying and, Operation Ranch Hand and so on, they didn't know it was dangerous.
Right.
No. Well,
I mean, the stunning thing is that it actually was known in small circles in the United States and Europe that it was dangerous. There was a book called Ecocide in Vietnam that was published in 1967, but got no press coverage except in the very left-wing press in the United States. And so it didn't, get into the mainstream media. There was a professor at Harvard, a scientist, who started doing tests on Agent Orange in the mid to late 60s, but none of that information came out at the time. So
Right.
we're going to take a short break, and we will be right back with more on Agent Orange. We are back. Agent Orange. What made it so dangerous? What made it so toxic? The answer is simple. Dioxin.
the interesting thing was that the Agent Orange that was manufactured by different companies varied in its amount of dioxin.
Mm-hmm.
So Diamond Shamrock, for example, the New Jersey company's was 1,000 times more than Monsanto's.
Really?
Yeah, so there was no
And
attention to any of the science of that.
no soldier alive, no veteran alive today would know. Oh, well, I was walking around in Dow's stuff,
Right.
or was I walking
Monsanto.
around in
Yeah.
Monsanto stuff?
Right.
Right.
This was only discovered later, yeah.
And there were other agents that weren't as strong, but were
Right.
still dumped. You
And
know,
the
they had
blue, the
the
white,
agent-
the
yeah.
red, the dip.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's also,
It was just chemical soup. They
right.
didn't have
Yeah,
anything.
Chemical soup,
It was
yeah.
a punch.
The government's approach, I would say, the American government's approach to this whole issue, beginning from when it was first used, was, the guys who are soldiers basically are in danger, and so we don't have to pay any attention at all to the nature of the danger we put them in. I mean, more was known about the toxicity of these chemicals than any of the soldiers knew.
Right.
And yet, the attitude was, let's not look at this. Let's not put this on the forests and jungles of Vietnam before we know whether it's safe or not for, I might also add, Vietnamese civilians, as well as soldiers. But it's just, this is part of, soldiers just being in danger, and we're just not really going to pursue it.
I think a real critical aspect of even the application of Agent Orange in Vietnam was whether or not it was militarily successful as a campaign. The whole purpose of it was to defoliate the jungles of South Vietnam so as to prevent the enemy from hiding.
Right.
And so when we speak of, like in the current war with Iraq, we have debates over what emboldens the enemy and what doesn't embolden the enemy. Actually, the enemy was using the issue of chemical warfare in Vietnam to persuade the Vietnamese people to have a rather dissatisfactory attitude towards our country as far as what we were doing. Were we actually working in their best interests, or we were very short-sighted in how we were applying it? So it's even its military success is in question.
So even if it was a military success,
Right.
it was a political failure from the get-go.
Yeah, exactly.
As far as the Vietnamese people.
If you deal with counterinsurgency, which is what the whole concept of what we were supposed to be doing there, at least we figured it out at some stage. It didn't work from a concept of counterinsurgency because the whole purpose at that point is to win the hearts and minds. And you're not winning the hearts and minds if you're destroying the people's livelihood and you're destroying their ability to eat without being poisoned.
Right.
Yeah, because we weren't just defoliating jungles. Right. There was actually a conscious policy also to defoliate rice fields.
Right.
To deprive
to kill the enemy's food supply.
Food supply, right.
Exactly.
So of course you're hitting, the food supply of the Vietnamese population.
Not to mention getting into the water table.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, the interesting thing about dioxin is it doesn't break down. It's absorbed into the soil, into the ground, into the water systems. And just recently I was looking at a documentary that's not even out yet, where they go back and they're taking to the Agent Orange Center in Ho Chi Minh City. They have this huge hospital, and they have thousands of unborn babies and born babies with, they look like a freak show, and they have them in these big jars. And then they have a ward of those that survived the birth with, I mean, there's no way, anything you can imagine that is totally out of the ordinary on a human being, you'll see them, and these babies are just sitting in cribs like prisoners by the hundreds, and they usually have about 350 on the ward, and about every year about 65 of them survive. And this is coming from the ministry there today, as we
because
speak.
also your body doesn't excrete dioxin. This is the problem. So everybody who was exposed to it, both American soldiers and the Vietnamese, are carrying around this dioxin in their bodies.
You're absolutely right on the money, Judy, because the dioxin stores itself in the fat cells of the body. And given time, everybody's metabolism is different. And some guys, the fat cells begin to break down and release the dioxin prior to others. Sometimes it's 20 years, sometimes less. And that's when it's detected. So if guys don't have any effects of the dioxin and the Agent Orange, they're unlikely in a lot of cases to go and get tested if there are no symptoms. And if they were to get tested prior.
I had no symptoms. And that was, and 2 years ago I was operated on for cancer, and it was linked to Agent Orange.
Right.
I had no symptoms, no idea.
Right.
And it was just because I went in for a physical with my doctor,
Right.
and he said, boy, this is aggressive, you got to deal with it now, or you're dead. And so that's what I did.
Where
That's
was the
what it
cancer, Tad?
is prostate.
Prostate.
Yeah.
And prostate cancer is on the VA list currently of the 11 presumptive conditions caused by exposure to Agent Orange. We will take a short break, and we will return with the dioxin discussion. This is C4 on Veterans Network. This is C4, and we are back with Dave Culmer, Shad Meshad, Judith Coburn, and Tad Foster. Dioxin, the evil chemical in Agent Orange. Did it really have to be there?
It's possible to make Agent Orange, or in various kinds of defoliants like this, without large amounts of dioxin, but it is produced as a byproduct or a contaminant. of
Right,
the
so if
Agent
it's a
Orange.
byproduct, doesn't that make you want to ask the question, could it be removed? Did it have to be there? Or this stuff's not going to work right without dioxin?
Based on the findings that came out in the Vietnam Map book, and it was published in 1981, which was when Agent Orange was starting to become an issue with Vietnam veterans.
Right.
It indicated in the book that the mixture of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, which were separate chemicals, okay, when those were mixed is when the dioxin was created.
Right.
One more process could have removed that dioxin, but it wasn't cost effective.
Wasn't cost effective, right.
So, yeah.
A little bit of dioxin goes a long way. And today, how many of us Vietnam veterans are still wearing a very
Once
small
again,
trace of it?
There were so many blunders, but the part of it that has been interesting is that there's thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of men and some women living with the after effects of a defoliant that is stored in our body fat, and as you've heard on the panel, and as we've heard in lectures all over the world about dioxin, it doesn't break down, and it's stored in our fat. And I think Dave Culmer explained it really very well in the sense that we don't know when that breaks down. I remember when it was finally announced that Vietnam vets that were, in quote, in country after the study and the map of 81 or whatever, that you could go in and have a biopsy. There was this window where you could go in, and I didn't want to know. I mean, because on one hand, if I know I've got it, it's like there's nothing they can do. They can't remove it. There's not a pill that can detoxify me from dioxin. And I chose, as my best friend who was in Vietnam as a infantryman, chose not to do it to this day. And then some days like today, I wonder, maybe I should have my fat checked and see if there is dioxin. But
There's nothing you can do,
I think what's really important is that people realize the nature of the dioxin itself. I mean, the dioxin was measured in parts per trillion, okay, which is, I can't even calculate parts per trillion.
No,
but I think the best example is a teaspoon of salt in a dump truck load of sand. That even then is not an acceptable level of dioxin in the human body.
yeah, and obviously if they spray, I mean, it's not like they spray and it
stays
lands,
there.
Right.
whatever. I mean, sprays, the wind,
Wind drift.
the air, the
Wind
moisture
drift.
in that area particularly
Absolutely.
carried. It was,
Yeah.
and also we never think about it, but I mean, we drank the water from there. We didn't have bottled water in those
No.
days. The water was purified, but you can't purify dioxin.
Dioxin,
And
exactly.
and that was, we inhaled, we engulfed
Right.
the water
I think
on
halazone
our whole
tablets.
tour. Yeah, but that doesn't kill
Right.
dioxin.
What I'm saying, you could put a ton of them in a canteen,
Monitor.
and it doesn't take the dioxin away.
Exactly. Tad, you've got that report there? Thank you. This is from an independent lab in Washington, D.C. regarding the half-life of dioxin while in the human body. Based on the fact that all atomic matter has a half-life at which time it breaks down, dioxin as follows. Tests have shown that on an average, dioxin has a half-life of 7.1 years in the human body. What this means is a person who has taken on 20 parts per trillion, let's say, of dioxin will have half of that, or 10 parts per trillion, remaining after 7 years. 7 years after that, or 14 total years after exposure, the remaining 10 parts per trillion will become 5 parts per trillion, and so on until the parts per trillion count is unmeasurable. So, for instance, if you were exposed and took on 20 parts per trillion in 1970, 28 years later, you would be down to 1 1/4 parts per trillion. And as a side note, the most parts per trillion of dioxin known by this lab or the VA to have existed in one Vietnam veteran's body, 99. This is C4. We will return. I recently read a quote made by a senior officer back in Vietnam, 1962, during those early days of Operation Ranch Hand, which then was known as Operation Hades. And basically what he said was, we had no idea that this spraying could in any way harm our own troops. This concludes part one of our first discussions on Agent Orange. Simply click to part two on C4 and we will resume with Agent Orange, The Last Battle. This is Rick Seaman for C4 on Veterans Network.